Whenever something socially progressive is posted about Sweden or Norway on Reddit, a dozen that only works because they're small countries with a homogeneous population posts pop up. Is there any scientific truth to this? I can't comment too much on social policies, but can say that there certainly are economic policies that would work regardless of the relative small size and homogeneous populations of Scandinavian countries. Oddly enough, their tax system is surprisingly non-progressive, as Canadian economist Stephen Gordon notes. It's somewhat counterintuitive as well, because a large reason for their comparative lack of income inequality is simply because their tax system is pretty much right out of an economics textbook and on its face seems regressive, not progressive. Gordon also has looked specifically at the issue you just raised. Even though it's relative to Canada, I think it might be useful to look at. They counter the regressive taxation with highly progressive welfare programs. Tax and welfare are two vitally important tools to look at. More regressive taxes tend to be more efficient at raising revenue. Welfare programs are much better at addressing inequality than taxes. Problems arise when people look at only one issue. For example, inequality stats in the US are almost universally reported pre-tax and pre-welfare. This paints a massively different picture of the state of the country than is actually the reality for individuals living and working in the country today. Sweden and Norway were much less progressive at the turn of the 20th century, and their small population and homogeneity weren't necessarily advantages in a more capitalistic neoliberal system. The workers and unions eventually took power and over a few decades created more equality, improved the economy, and tightened regulations to create the society you see today. Whether it can be attributed to homogeneity is tough to say, but if you look at a country like Canada, for example, which is much more progressive than the USA, it is a very multicultural society. In terms of small population, Germany and France outspend Norway when it comes to the percentage of GDP allocated to social programs, and they are the two most populous European countries, if you don't count Russia. It's hard to say definitively, but to me, it seems like this is a talking point created for use by conservatives. When you're dealing with economic theories and comparing them to real-world examples that have small sample sizes and a great deal of variables, I'm sure statistics and arguments could be made for both sides of the coin. I doubt there's a clear-cut answer to this, but I'll try to get the ball rolling. It would be easier to deal with a specific example though, because this is a pretty broad question. Something socially progressive could mean a lot of things: redistributive policies, welfare systems, etc., socialist policies like public education or health care, or social policy like marriage equality. Homogeneous population could also be interpreted several ways. Are we talking strictly about ethnic/racial diversity, or also more general cultural diversity, which could be of the same race? For example, should Quebec decrease Canada's homogeneity score? Or even socio-economic diversity, class or income inequality? Here are some somewhat disorganized thoughts. Canada springs to mind as an interesting counterexample to this argument, being both very diverse and fairly socially progressive. Though okay, it's not as socially progressive as Scandinavia, and it is still quite small in terms of population. A counterexample in the opposite direction might be Japan or South Korea, which are both very ethnically/culturally homogeneous but also tend to have somewhat regressive attitudes in some ways. People sometimes use these countries to argue the exact opposite, that homogeneity allows a stronger sense of a tradition and doesn't create the same push for progressive policies. As a hypothetical example, if 99% of your population is the same religion, who's going to fight for religious tolerance? Or a secularized state? Here is a map of immigrant population by country. Again, that's not necessarily the best measure of homogeneity, but it's one consideration. As you can see, the rates for Scandinavia aren't so different from the US and the rest of Europe. Here is a map of Gini coefficient by country, a measurement of income inequality. You can see that the US does have markedly higher income inequality than Scandinavia. But this also demonstrates that income inequality and racial diversity don't necessarily correlate. Which is why we'd really need to define which one we mean in order to really answer this question. The main difficulty with this question, I think, will be separating cause and effect. Unless you want to define homogeneity strictly on racial terms, it's going to be hard to figure out causality. Class inequality and the strength of the welfare state are the obvious example. Was it easier to implement a generous welfare state because the population was economically homogeneous? Or is the population economically homogeneous because of the generous welfare state? This obviously doesn't apply only to economic inequality either. The reason that there is still a distinct black culture in America after 200+ years is obviously that regressive social policies in the form of institutionalized racism kept blacks and whites deliberately separated. No. For instance, take Netherlands. It has legalized euthanasia, same-sex marriage, first to re-legalize in 2001, soft drugs, prostitution, abortion. Yet it is ethnically diverse, with less than 80% of the population being ethnic NL. It also has the two most international cities in the world, Amsterdam and Zaandam, which both vote leftist and/or progressive. Homosexuality was illegal here until 1971, abortion until 1981, etc. The country was more conservative and homogeneous at the time. There are other diverse countries that are more progressive than average, like the US, and tons of ethnically homogeneous countries that are deeply retarded. Without specifics, the answer can only be yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there is no one-size-fits-all answer for all countries. Cultural and other differences can be very important, and not everything that works in Sweden would work in the USA. I'm assuming you're American. And many things that work in Norway work because Norway has more oil than it knows what to do with and would not work without that source of funding. No, in the sense that your progressive ideas wouldn't work in America, is a knee-jerk response among people who either A. are trying to argue that a progressive idea like universal health care can't work, in which case the fact that it works in Norway is perfectly germane, and or B. base their arguments not on any knowledge of the actual situation in America but on how a model economy one made up, essentially, of a bunch of supply-demand charts should work. But this textbook economy bears far less resemblance to the actual, real-world American economy than the actual, real-world Norwegian or Swedish economies do, and if you can't use the Swedish experience, or even the Canadian experience, to draw conclusions about the American economy, then you certainly can't conclude anything from what happens in a textbook.